Thank you. I'm okay. Good morning. Good morning. I hope everyone's doing great. Let's learn in the memory Le'iloi Nishmat, the Bibas family. We should really be spending the next several days or weeks studying in their memory. Good morning, Elaine. I hope everything's okay. All right, so we are continuing with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's discussion in the Kuzari at the end of the fourth essay to talk about the expert knowledge of the rabbis in areas of different areas of science and medicine. And here Rabbi Yehuda Halevi once again is trying to demonstrate how our tradition is extremely robust and rich and filled with knowledge, so that we shouldn't feel in any way inferior to the other cultures that seem to boast of advanced technologies and knowledge. So one of the things he was talking about are the laws of Terefa, and how the rabbis must have known, had needed to know a tremendous amount of knowledge about about zoology and anatomy in order for them to know when an animal is treifa and when it's not treifa, because that has to do with a determination of the viability of certain internal organs, okay? So that's where we were up to. Not a very germane topic to things that you and I would encounter in Judaism in everyday life, but nevertheless, a sort of point of pride that look at how expert the rabbis were in certain areas of knowledge. We're just going to touch on a few of these points, go through them very quickly. The sages also knew about relationships. We're on the bottom of page 485 in the Feldheim edition. The sages also knew about relationships between the organs of the physical part of the body and the organs of the spiritual part of the body. What do you think he means by that? If you take a look in the footnote, he says the physical organs are those below the diaphragm, in this case, the testicles, and the corresponding spiritual organ is the brain. Now, this is something that medieval scientists going back to Talmudic times had talked about. They thus said that the brain has two membranes and that the corresponding membranes surround the testicles. And they went through the rest of this paragraph. There are also many other similarities that correspond between the sexual reproduction organs of males and the brain. Now, this is fascinating because I thought that this was an archaic form of science. You know, there are a lot of archaic things that you'll find in the Talmud, but, you know, then I just did a little poking around. The National Library of Medicine published a scholarly article in June of 2021, Brain and Testes, More Alike Than Previously Thought. And so, not that this should be a point of fascination for you, so I'll just read for you the abstract of this article. Several strands of evidence indicate the presence of marked similarities between human brain and testes. Understanding these similarities and their implications has become a topic of interest among the scientific community. This is 2021. Okay, I guess during COVID, they didn't have much else to do. Indeed, an association of intelligence with some semen quality parameters has been reported, and a relation between dysfunctions of the human brain and testes has also been evident. Numerous common molecular features are evident when these tissues are compared, which is reflected in the huge number of common proteins. At the functional level, human neurons and sperm share a number of characteristics, including the importance of the exocytotic process and the presence of similar receptors and signaling pathways. The common proteins are mainly involved in exocytosis, tissue development, and neuron-brain-associated biological processes. With this analysis, we conclude that human brain and testes share several biochemical characteristics, which in addition to their involvement in the speciation process, could at least in part be responsible for the expression of a huge number of common proteins. Nonetheless, this is an underexplored topic, and the connection between these tissues needs to be clarified, which could help to understand the dysfunctions affecting brain and testes, as well as to develop improved therapeutic strategies. Okay, so there, in very, very stylized language, scholarly language, you have an expression of what was already known to the sages in the times of the Gemara. Probably fell into disuse over centuries, and now it's being rediscovered. There are so many things that modern science rediscovers that ancient civilizations had tremendous knowledge about. We still don't fully understand how they were able to build the pyramids or places like Stonehenge and things like that, right? And so we look at these things and we sort of scratch our heads sometimes. And areas of knowledge about anatomy is no exception. Now, why is this relevant? This is relevant from a halachic standpoint because the rabbis, in examining an animal, could look at the testes, for example, and make determinations about membranes on the brain. So that's why this has halachic ramifications if you want to determine whether an animal is a trefa or not. We're just going to skip to the next paragraph, subparagraph number 4 on page 486. They also knew which diseases were fatal and which were not. And that's really important because if an animal has a non-fatal disease, it's still kosher. You may not want to eat it because it may have a diseased tissue, but it's not non-kosher. It just may not be desirable. They thus said regarding the spinal cord that as long as the membrane is intact, its marrow is of no consequence. They also said that if the marrow of one's spine is depleted, this renders the animal sterile. They further said any membrane on the lung that developed because of injury is not considered a membrane. Okay, so this directly has to do with tuberculosis, and certain types of tuberculosis render an animal a trefa, and others do not. If an animal has a membrane that grows on top of the lung, which indicates that it previously had some kind of puncture, but that it healed, in many cases, if it was due to an injury, the animal is still kosher. They also stated the gid hanashe, the forbidden sciatic nerve, does not apply to fowl because they have no hip socket. And so how did the rabbis know these things? They knew these things based on tradition and based on perhaps sharing knowledge with other cultures, although Rabbi Yehuda Halevi doesn't feel that one needs to rely on that. He feels that we have always had independent knowledge of science. An example of their precise halachic reasoning is, and he quotes here, if a kosher animal nursed from a trefa animal, the milk found inside its stomach is forbidden, but the animal is still kosher. Okay, so if you have, let's say, a calf who was nursing from a camel, okay, camels are non-kosher animals. You have to be careful when you go to Dubai and the UAE, because one of the delicacies is milk chocolate that's made from camel milk. So the question that we had when we traveled to the UAE was, could you go to Starbucks and order a coffee with milk with the assumption that it was cow's milk? And the answer is, according to the Rabbanim there, that yes, because camel milk is so much more expensive than cow's milk, no one would use camel milk as a substitute for cow's milk. But let's say a calf was suckling from a camel, which could happen if there's no mother available. The calf is still kosher for consumption, but you have to discard any milk that you find inside its stomach. If a trefa animal nursed from a kosher animal, the milk found, or for that matter, let's say it's a cow that is trefa. Let's say a cow is giving milk, but the cow itself is not a kosher animal because it has certain tuberculosis or other mortal diseases which would render it not kosher. The calf that's suckling from it is still kosher. If a trefa animal nursed from a kosher animal, the milk found inside its stomach because it is protected within. So there seems to be a very completely sealed off membrane within the stomach lining that prevents the milk from receiving any flavor from the non-kosher animal that ingested the milk, and that's why the milk is kosher. Okay, Here's an example of something they prohibited with clear wisdom, but which is beyond our grasp. They said that 5 membranes are prohibited: the brain's membrane, the testicles membrane, the spleen's membrane, the kidney's membrane, and the tailbone's membrane. All of these may not be eaten. And presumably it's because the rabbis had some tradition about these membranes. Perhaps they're attached to certain kinds of fat that are forbidden. I don't remember offhand, but that's what's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. One of their amazing laws regarding treifa animals is their delineation of how far an animal must fall, such that if it were pushed from that height, the animal would be forbidden because of shattered limbs. If an animal sustains serious injury, some serious internal injury, it becomes a treifa. So the Talmud deliberates how far of a fall must an animal have in order for us to assume that it's now a treifa. Okay? They then said if one left the animal above and upon his return found the animal below, we do not worry about shattered limbs because the animal estimates for itself. This means that the animal estimates the jump for itself and intentionally leaps. This is why it is not injured by the fall as it is when we push it. It is because when one leaps, the body's equilibrium is present and on the alert, whereas when one is pushed, this equilibrium disappears. So that requires veterinary science. It requires a knowledge of how animals behave when they jump or when they're pushed. And this also requires a lot of wisdom. Next paragraph. Some more examples of their amazing laws and their empirical knowledge are: if an animal's lung is dry because of an act of God, it is kosher. But if this was caused by an act of man, it is treifa on account of a withered lung. And what they mean here is that if an animal is frightened from some psychological reason that is not brought upon it by human sources, so then the animal is still kosher, even though the lung, let's say the animal is depressed or distressed, or it has psychotic episodes. Animals can also have those experiences. So it may experience because of its anxiety, a withered lung, a lung that shrinks in size. The animal is still kosher. If, however, it was frightened by a human being, the animal, when it manifests a sign of a withered lung, then it's a treifa. They further stated that the way to resolve this matter is to soak the lung in lukewarm water for 24 hours. If it then returns to its healthy state, the animal is kosher. If not, it is treifa. So if you do a post-mortem, which is what they would do, they would shecht an animal, and then they would check its lungs. That was the major organ that you had to check, and still to this day. So then if you see a withered lung, you'd have to see, how do we determine whether this withered lung is from its own internal psychosis or whether it was frightened by an external source? And the answer is soak it for 24 hours in water and see if it expands back to its normal size. That's what I have no idea. I've never heard of this being done on a practical basis. Okay. They further stated, if the lung is bluish in color, it is kosher, but if it is ink black, it is treifa. Why? Because the black is really red that has turned bad. If it is greenish, it is kosher. They further stated that a lung which has partially reddened is kosher, but if it has completely reddened, it is treifa. These are all manifestations of disease. Some diseases are mortal diseases and some are not, and you have to know the colors of the lung. And then I will just do one more paragraph, and this one doesn't have to do with animal anatomy, veterinary science. It has to do with human anatomy, which is related. The Talmud records that they brought a greenish, jaundiced newborn child before Rabbi Nassan Habavli, meaning the child had jaundice. If any of you remember seeing a jaundiced baby, this is a very common phenomenon. It means that the bilirubin levels are high. Sometimes it's due to an underdeveloped liver, because many times newborns, their liver doesn't kick in and start working for a few days. And usually almost 99% of the time, it is not a manifestation of anything serious. However, the Gemara records that it is important if you see jaundice, to have the doctor check the baby. And different moyalim have different traditions as to whether or not to go ahead with the bris or not, depending upon the level of jaundice, the bilirubin number. Okay, so when I trained as a moyal, I received my tradition as well. So this is all based on this story that they brought a child who looked jaundiced, looked yellow, and they brought him before Rabbi Nassan Habavli. He told them, wait, don't do the bris right away. Wait until his color comes back and his skin looks red again, because what it means is, he said, is that the blood is not circulating well. So you have to wait until the blood starts circulating well before he can have his bris. This meant that they were not to circumcise him until his blood had fully circulated through his flesh. They followed his instructions, and as a result, the child lived, even though his earlier siblings had died immediately after their circumcisions. So this was some kind of genetic issue that required that apparently the baby did not have, its circulatory system was not developed yet upon birth, and therefore he saved the baby's life. Another time, they brought a ruddy newborn baby before him. The baby was overly reddish, okay? And he told them, wait until his blood is absorbed within him. In other words, apparently the baby is extremely, maybe has not developed a clotting factor yet. And that's the reason why he looks so red, okay? They too followed his instructions, and the child lived. They named each child Natan Habavli after him, which is really funny because I can certainly imagine naming a child Natan, which I have a grandson named Natan, but to name your child Natan Habavli, Nathan the Babylonian, right? That's a mouthful, right? But they wanted to honor Natan Habavli, the sage, who really saved these two babies' lives. And so they named the baby after him. Again, an indication that our rabbis had a very sophisticated knowledge of medicine, zoology, veterinary sciences, and so forth. Okay, anything we just see? It does continue going on. Talks about the symptoms of treifa. I think we'll skip to page 490, and we'll go to subparagraph 13. The rabbis also knew how to tell if a species of fowl is kosher. They said, and by the way, this is an important principle because the Torah gives symptoms of kosher mammals and of kosher fish, but it doesn't give any signs of kosher fowl. So if I was to ask you, what are the signs of a kosher mammal?
Well, you say birds of prey or not.
Hooves and chews its cud. Kosher fish, fins and scales. Kosher birds, we do not have any signs that are itemized in the Torah. The Torah doesn't say that if a bird has these signs, it's kosher, and if not, not. And so what the halacha boils down to is that a community, if they've always been eating a certain bird, that bird is considered to be kosher. What if a bird is introduced and comes to the rabbi and we have no tradition about it? So then, Karen, is it solely dependent upon being a bird of prey? Not always. So they said, we place the bird on a taut string, like on a telephone pole, a telephone wire, but they didn't have telephone wires back then. So they would take a taut string, tie it to two poles, and place the bird and see how its talons grab the string. If it splits its talons 2 to one side and 2 to the other side, then it is a non-kosher bird. But if it places 3 on one side and 1 on the other side, then it's a kosher bird. They also said that if the bird catches food in its mouth and eats it, this is a sign, as if you toss a piece of food to the bird and it catches it in its mouth, that's a sign that it's a non-kosher bird. Also, because kosher birds, I guess, would wait until it drops to the ground, and then they would eat it that way. They also said that any bird that dwells together with and resembles a non-kosher bird is also a non-kosher bird, such as a starling living with a raven. This is all from the Gemara and Tractate Chulin and is codified in the Shulchan Aruch as well. Okay.
Rabbi, doesn't the Torah also just name several birds? I don't know if they named the species, but Hayan Shuf.
Yeah, a number of birds are mentioned by name. But let's say, for example, the turkey is never mentioned by name in the Torah. So there's a lot of discussion about whether turkeys are kosher birds or not, because they're not identified in the Torah as being a non-kosher bird. But at the same time, we don't know whether that bird was even endemic to the desert and the Middle East at the time when the Torah was given. So do we have any knowledge about whether turkeys are kosher? And essentially, what the poskim say is that you can either use some of these signs for birds that are not addressed, or if a community has a tradition. I gave a shir on turkey a couple of years ago. I guess it was in honor of Thanksgiving. I don't remember. And if a community has been eating turkey for generations, then that's a sign that it's a kosher bird. That's what some of the poskim say. It's a bit of a nebulous reason for eating a bird, but it seems that we place our trust in Jewish communities to testify that this bird is kosher. Linda has her hand up. Linda, did you want to?
Hi, yeah. So this is kind of exactly the reason why I would say why we should question things. This going back to last week, because when you talk about something like that, about a bird throwing its head back or some obscure little detail that makes something like how would they arrive at that? How would they to me they seem really random, these points, these descriptions. So I mean, if there's no history of how
How'd I go up?
Yeah, so I think it goes to Karen's comment, which is the rabbis noted that generally speaking, birds of prey are the ones that are identified in the Torah as being non-kosher. And these are symptoms of birds of prey. The way they position their talons, the way that they catch food in their mouth, this is all indicative of that these animals are carnivores. And that's the reason why they're considered to be non-kosher. Okay, does that help you?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. All right, so I think we'll hold it here. And let's go to our Parsha discussion. I'm sorry, this is like the portion. Should we just go a little bit further in the Kuzari so that we can maybe finish cover a little bit more ground? No, you had enough? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
Fish and also we basically exclude animals of prey and fish of prey.
Right, but it's funny because the Torah never says the reason. It's commentaries like the Abarbanel say that when an animal has split hooves, it means that it's because it bends down to the ground. It bends its torso down to the ground, and it needs split hooves to position itself and balance itself when it's bending down. And when it chews its cud, it means it's a ruminant that has to digest herbs and vegetables and grass. And that's the reason why it has multiple stomachs, for digesting vegetation. So that's the theory, but we don't necessarily know if that's really, we don't know 100% if that's the reason. That's basically what I'm saying. Because the Torah never makes a point of saying it. So in essence, we still consider it to be one of the chukim, like one of the laws that we don't really have a full explanation for. I think a pig is also mostly, although I could be mistaken, it eats the same stuff as cows, no? Or maybe, I don't know. They eat anything? Okay. They do have split hooves. That's why they call some people pigs. Okay. But yeah. All right. Anyway. Okay, so let's go to the Parsha. So one of the interesting things to note is that when the Torah describes, this Shabbos, by the way, is both Rosh Chodesh and Parsha Shkolim. and Parshas Terumah. We're going to focus on the Parsha, but it is noteworthy that we're going to be taking out 3 Sifrei Torah, if I'm not mistaken. We take out one for the Parsha, one for Rosh Chodesh, and one for Parsha Shkolim this Shabbos. For Terumah, yeah, Terumah. What did I? Yeah, I meant to say Terumah. Sorry.
What do we do for the Haftorah?
We do the Haftorah for Shkolim. Yeah. Okay. So what I felt was noteworthy is that there are 2 ways to describe the sanctuary that Hashem asks us to build in the desert. The first time God identifies by name the edifice that he asks us to build, he does not call it a mishkan, which is the normal term that we have for the movable tabernacle in the midbar, in the desert. The very first time that the Torah tells us to build a structure, it says, Ve'asu li mikdash. They shall build a sanctuary. In English, I guess you could say Mishkan and Mikdash have 2 different translations. Mikdash, from the word kadosh, would be a sanctuary, a place of sanctity. And a Mishkan would be a tabernacle. I have to see what the origin of the word tabernacle is. I'm not sure. But I will dwell in their midst. That's what God says. And then he says, K'chol asher ani mareh otcha, eit tavnit hamishkan. The very next verse calls it by a different name. And if you look in Parshas Terumah, you will discover that there are 19 times when the Torah calls this edifice a mishkan, and there's only 1 time when it calls it a mikdash.
Is that?
Now,
There's only 1 time where it's called a mikdash, and
That's
many
right.
times.
That's right.
Mhm.
It's only 1 time when the mishkan in the desert is called a mikdash.
Yeah, you hear?
Yeah. And then all the other times it's called a mishkan. Okay. Now the Gemara observes this. The Gemara says, Bishlama mikdash ikri mishkan, dichti v'natati mishkani b'tochechem. We know that sometimes the temple in Jerusalem is called a mishkan because there's a verse in the Tochacha in Sefer Vayikra in Parshat Bechukotai, which says that I will, if you follow my laws, v'natati mishkani b'tochechem, I will place my mishkan in your midst, which the Gemara understands is a reference to the future temple. Ela mishkan di'ikri mikdash minalan. But how do we know that the mishkan in the desert, the temporary edifice, is also called a mikdash? Ela mehacha, so I'm skipping a little bit. Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, u'chetiv k'chol asher ani mareh otcha eitav nita mishkan. The Gemara quotes these 2 verses that we find at the beginning of our parsha. You see that the Torah uses these words interchangeably, both mikdash and mishkan, to describe the temporary edifice that is being built. So I just thought it would be interesting to have a little bit of an exercise to discuss what the difference between these 2 words are and why the Mishkan would sometimes be called a Mishkan, why it would sometimes be called a Mikdash. What's the difference between the 2? And once we have established the difference between the 2, let's see what the practical lessons are, because we all know that we're called upon to build ourselves a sanctuary for ourselves in a non-literal way, but in a metaphorical way. So one explanation is from the Shemi Shmuel, quoting his father, the Avnei Nezer, who says, my father used to say, the Mikdash nikra mitzad Yisrael, shehem mitgadshim v'nivdalim min hachomriyut. He says, the word Mikdash comes from the word kadosh. What is the definition of sanctity? To abstain from certain indulgences in this physical world. That's what the term Kedoshim Tiyu means, to be abstinent. And if that's the main translation of the word Kadosh or Kedusha, so then a Mikdash is a place where a person withdraws from the physical world in order to find some connection to Hashem. V'hu dibuk Yisrael ba'avihen shebashamayim mimata lemala. And that represents, if you call the Mishkan a mikdash, you're describing the human action of what a Jew must do in order to reach the objective of that edifice. And he has to be mekadesh. He has to sanctify himself before entering that edifice and be prepared to divest himself of the physical indulgences of this world to be able to reach his Father in heaven. What does the word Mishkan therefore mean? Mishkan nikra mitzad Hashem yitbarach, sheshochein betoch amo Yisrael. The word Mishkan is not, so Mikdash is bottom to top. From this world, what a human being has to do in order to reach God above. And Mishkan is the opposite direction. It is from above, God's action coming down into this world. Because what is the source or the root of Mishkan? Shochein. That God will insert his dwelling place in this world. That God dwells within Bnei Yisrael. V'hu hadibuk mimala lamata. And therefore it is God coming down and attaching himself to us in this world. V'haya hamakom hahu makom chibur mimata lamala umimala lamata al kain nikra bishnei hashemot. The tabernacle and the temple, they both serve the same purpose in that they both are for the purpose of a Jew or actually any human being, elevating himself or herself from this world and going upwards, taking the elevator, so to speak, up to heaven. And it is also the place for God to press the down button and take the elevator down into our world. And that's therefore a bilateral process that God has work to do when he tells us to build a Mishkan, and Israel has work to do when we are told to build a Mishkan. And this is the meeting place of where the twain shall meet. Okay, so that's why you have both terms, Mikdash and Mishkan, to describe the very same edifice, but depending upon the orientation. Okay, so that's one working definition of why sometimes the Torah says Mikdash and sometimes it says Mishkan. Now, as it pertains to our parsha, it makes very good sense why Hashem says Ve'asu li Mikdash. Make for me a sanctuary, because your part of the job is to have a place where you'll be able to ascend. But as a result of your work, it will result in a Mishkan where I will be able to descend. That's really what Hashem is saying. And so the first commandment is Mikdash, and all subsequent references to the Mishkan that you will build refer to enabling Hashem to come down into this world. So far, so good? Okay. Let's look at Rav Kook, and other commentaries say the same idea, that Mishkan and Mikdash can be used interchangeably, but one refers to a temporary place and one refers to a permanent place. This is Rav Kook in Shmona Kvatzim, and he says something very profound. HaMishkan haya lema'ala min ha'olam. There's an inherent difference between the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. The Mishkan is transcendent. It is otherworldly. V'lachein ba'olam lo haya yachol litfos ki im ma'amad arai. And it is for that reason that the Mishkan was otherworldly, that it could not occupy a permanent location in this world. The reason why the Mishkan is constantly moving from station to station, by the way, it's a bit of a misnomer to say that it was constantly moving. We know for 38 of the 40 years, the Mishkan was in one place. But it's described as being a temporary structure that is meant to be dismantled and reconstructed as the Jews would travel. And it's also important to note that when we came into Eretz Yisrael, the Mishkan was the temporary temple that stood for 369 years in Shiloh before the temple was built. Okay, it was later captured by the Philistines, and we lost it, but it was there. It was our temple for 3.5 centuries. So that's a pretty long time. I'd like to challenge anyone to point me to a shul where they daven that's been standing for 3.5 centuries. Not exactly easy to find. There may be something in Europe, but
There's one in the States.
there is one 369 years old. What in?
Israel something.
Yeah, in I think in Rhode Island maybe, or is it in
There's
Philadelphia? Newport, Newport News. I'm not sure. Anyway, okay. No, Providence. Is it okay? Anyway, yeah, Esther. That's your homework. Okay. Okay. So Rav Kook writes that nonetheless, despite the fact that the Mishkan did occupy places for even centuries, but it's still considered to be a temporary place because of its otherworldly nature. Something that doesn't belong in this world because of its transcendence cannot have a permanent fixture in this world. That's why it's called Ohel Moed. It's called the tent. The Torah calls the Mishkan a tent. A tent is not meant to be permanent. Umitzad ha'ara'ayut shelo hu mechuvan neged olam katan me'oto hagodel shel beit olamim. He says, because of its temporariness, it has the same proportions, just a much more miniaturized version of what would eventually go into the permanent temple. Aval legabe Moshe haytazot hagadlut shelamala min ha'olam kivua. He says, as far as Moshe was concerned, this was actually an advantage, that just like Moshe was otherworldly in a sense, the Mishkan that he was in charge of building was also otherworldly, because it really corresponded to the more real realm of heaven. V'alkein davka mitoch hakdamat hamishkan haya hamikdash efshar lavo bizmano. Now he says something truly profound, and that is, it was necessary to have a temporary Mishkan before we could build a permanent temple. And why is that? Is that the Mishkan is sort of the intermediary stage to allow for something that is somewhat unnatural to occur. You needed first to build a temporary Mishkan to allow the giving rise of a permanent structure that would mean that Hashem was permanently affixed in Olam Hazeh. His Shechina was permanently fixed in Olam Hazeh. And that's not something easy to do. So it's almost like a transition phase. Just to give you by way of analogy, you sometimes have restaurants that open up, and what do they call they don't fully open. What do they call that? A soft, no, they call it a soft opening, right? Because we're not really ready to give you our full menu, and we're not really sure if we're gonna make it. So we give you a limited menu, we see how the customers come, we see how it works, and then eventually we do the full opening. The Mishkan represents that necessary intermediate stage to enable a temple to find its footing in this world. So, Balkein davka mitoch hakdamat hamishkan haya mikdash efshar lavo bizmano. That it was only through the presence of a Mishkan that the temple could be built in its time. The ahava rabbah de Moshe garma ahavat olam de beit olamim. Now, notice what he says. We have two terms in our prayers. We have ahava rabbah and we have ahavat olam. Where do we find those two terms, ahava rabbah and ahavat olam? Anyone know? Right before the Shema. It's the bracha before Shema. And at least in Nusach Ashkenaz, in the morning we say ahava rabbah ahavtanu. You have loved us a great love. And in the evening, before Shema, we say ahavat olam. We open the same bracha with an eternal love. What's the difference between an ahava rabbah, which is an intense love, and an eternal love. Okay, so there's a big difference. When a couple is courting each other, that's ahava rabbah. Oh, I can't wait. I can't stop thinking about her. I can't wait until the next time I can call her, that the next time that we can go out. My passion is intense. Okay. What is ahava rabbah? When we've been married for 40 years. Okay. Avat olam. That's the eternal love. It may not be as intense, but it has lasting power. That's ahavat olam. And the commentaries point out something quite interesting, at least in Nusach Ashkenaz. The reason why we say Rabbah in the morning and Ahavat Olam at night is because Ahava Rabbah represents daytime. Daytime is where we can see manifest God's beauty and God's blessings in the world. At nighttime, when it's dark, that represents times when things are not as clear, where you cannot see God's blessings in the world as much, and that does happen at times of a religious persecution, where it's called a time of darkness. Okay, and so the reason why we say Ahava Rabbah in the morning is because we are ready to face the new day and optimistic that Hashem is going to love us on this new day. And we hear the birds chirping, and we see the sun shining, and all the snow is melting, and everything is beautiful. And Hashem we have this intense love for Hashem. He has this intense love for us, and we can say Ahava Rabbah. By the time we're ready to go to bed at night, there's a certain anxiety. Perhaps things are dark, and things are not as we had expected them to be. And so we say, I know you love me, Hashem, and I love you, even though it's hard for me to always see that so clearly. But it's an eternal love. It's a love that never dies. And that's why we say Ahavat Olam in Ma'ariv and Ahava Rabbah in Shacharit. Now, with that in mind, Rav Kook says that this is the duality of the Mishkan versus the Beit HaMikdash. The Mishkan is Ahava Rabbah, that intense love that was represented by Moshe, that otherworldly spirituality, which is very, very difficult for the average person to attain. And the temple represents Ahavat Olam, the eternal love, the love that has lasting power, like long after the credits, after the movie are over. Right? The movie itself, the chick flick movie, right, is Ahava Rabbah. You'll forgive my misogyny. Yeah, I know. Sorry about that. Is Ahava Rabbah, the love story. And then after the credits roll, that's Ahavat Olam. So the Mishkan represents the romance that Moshe is able to represent, because he has this intensity of an otherworldly kind of spirituality. That's the Mishkan. And by its very nature, it must be temporary. It cannot last. You cannot be passionately in love every single second of every single day. It just doesn't happen. I don't believe it, right? It's not even practical, right? But you have, after the credits roll, you have Ahavat Olam. And that's the Beit HaMikdash. That's the temple that has a permanent fixture. It's like the matrimonial home. It's like the difference between the chuppah and the matrimonial home. The chuppah is the place which is where you rent the hall, and it's not your place, and it doesn't belong to you, and it's something that you're going to only use temporarily. And the matrimonial home is where you go and you have to take out the garbage and wash the dishes and do the laundry and all of the household chores and fix all of the, and it's just got the tedium of everyday life, but that's Ahavat Olam. So that's the difference between Mishkan, according to Rav Kook. Mishkan is the temporary, intense place of spirituality, and Beit HaMikdash, Mikdash, he says, is the place of Ahavat Olam, eternal love that has a fixed place in this world that is more mundane. Okay? So that's another definition. So I just want to suggest using the first two definitions that we've come to, is that we need to start, we would do well to think about how we try to create a Mishkan or a Mikdash in our own lives. Using the first definition of Mishkan versus Mikdash, we are tasked with building a Mikdash. And what is a Mikdash? A place where God would feel comfortable coming. So the idea of a Mikdash means not only do I have an obligation to build my community synagogue, I have to contribute towards that. And as a matter of fact, the Shulchan Aruch writes that if you live in a community that has a synagogue, you're obligated to financially support the synagogue. That's not for now. I'm not here to ask for donations, right? But that's actually a halacha, right? But more than that, I have to create a habitation in my own life, in my own heart and soul, and in my home perhaps as well, where Hashem will feel comfortable. The Kutzker said, when someone said, "Where is God?" So he said, anywhere you allow him to reside. We have an obligation to create a residence for Hashem. And how do we do that? By being mekadesh, by sanctifying ourselves. So the decor that you have in your home, the decor that you use for your clothing, and the way that you display yourself, and the way that you display your home. You want to make sure that your guests will feel comfortable when they come into your home. But even more importantly, you want to make sure that the Ribono Shel Olam will feel comfortable when he comes to visit your home. Yes, Karen, go ahead.
On that thing, ask a tangential question,
Mhm.
which is that you have to make yourself holy. And I noticed in Vayikra, there's a lot of like making things holy. They aren't just essentially holy, right? Like I had like non-Jewish friends and say, well, but the rabbi, he's holy. And then it's like, yes, you are, but I'm saying that are people like people and things, like it seems like you designate the Kohanim to be like we create holiness. We designate them as holy. There's such like, I'm trying to understand that because I mean I can't find the psukim right now to tell you that. Right?
Are you asking what's the difference between inherent holiness and the action of sanctification?
They're asking, is anything inherently holy unless we make it holy? Like is Shabbat holy in itself? Like from God's perspective, yes,
Yeah.
but from our perspective,
Well, that goes back to the age-old question of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi versus the Rambam, right? Let's talk about Eretz Yisrael for just a second, the land of Israel. Is the land of Israel inherently holy, or is it dependent upon what we do on that land to designate it as being a holy place?
and then as an adjunct, I once saw Rabbi Tendler, I think I'm getting the right person, but I could be wrong, up on Har HaBayit and saying like, it is not currently holy. I could be wrong with Rabbi Tendler, but there was somebody, oh, you're looking shocked, but okay. So there was some person of a great name and saying that it is holy, but right now it doesn't have the same designation as it would. Should we?
There is an opinion in the Rishonim that says that with the destruction of the second temple, the holiness that existed in the second Beit HaMikdash has left. But we don't paskin that way. We paskin that the original Kedusha that was in the temple has remained and has never left.
But even so, we had there was a ceremony to create.
Right. There is this concept of when the Shechina departs, there is a loss of Kedusha. But that's a very Halevian way of viewing it. For the Rambam, Kedusha is based upon our behavior. If Hashem says you need to behave differently in Eretz Yisrael in the way that you treat your agriculture, because I have designated that agriculture as having holiness, then it all has to do with not intrinsic Kedusha, but the way that Hashem wishes us to interact with his world, that it makes something holy.
It comes back to us.
It's a question of whether it's behavioral, if sanctity is behavioral or intrinsic to people, places, and things. And that's not an easy question to answer because it's a debate. It's a debate, okay?
So that concept that certain dimensions can have holiness attached to them, like the Zman of Shabbat.
Yeah, again,
Whether you keep it or not.
yeah, that's the conventional approach of the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and so many others. That's the more mystical we become when we connect heaven and earth like that and say that physical things can be imbued with
Because like somebody's
Right. So you sanctify things by following a set of protocols. And many times, and then the question is, so what becomes of that object once you've done that protocol? Is it now transformed intrinsically, or does it now have a designated status because of a behavior that was acted upon it? So we're not going to get into that now, okay? But I do want to just say, so for the first definition, I have to make a mikdash, and then Hashem will be shochen in that place that I've sanctified. According to Rav Kook's definition, I think there's value in making a distinction in our minds between something that is temporary and something that is permanent, because we all recognize that there are temporary holy places that we can imbue with holiness because of our passion, and there are also permanent holy places which we can sometimes take for granted because it's ahavat olam and not ahava rabbah. So let me just give you an example. When we were on our trip to Israel this past time, we went to the site of the Nova Festival, and you can feel holiness in that site because of the massacre that took place there. We went, and I mentioned this in my drasha, we went to an agricultural plant where they cultivate bulbs of flowers that they export to different countries. And they brought us to a refrigerator, large walk-in refrigerator, which they use to refrigerate the plants before they're ready to be shipped out. And there was a big sign on top of the refrigerator that said, this is where 80 chayalim and chayalot were stored after they were massacred on October 7th. And they were stored here in order before their bodies could be taken to their final burial site. Eretz al techasi damam, land, do not cover their blood. And you feel sometimes that there is a certain ahava rabbah, or a kedusha, that is not meant to be permanent, but is meant to linger there for a certain designated period of time, where you have a religious experience in a place which is not designated as the permanent place for holiness. And those are the mishkanim of life, okay? But then there are the mikdashim of life, where you perhaps visit them regularly, and they become your habitual place of religious expression, like a shul. And one has to be very careful not to abuse that place because of its familiarity, because of its ahavat olam, and not because of its ahava rabbah. So that's the difference for Rav Kook between a mishkan and a mikdash. Okay, finally, I just want to look at Rav Dessler, where he says in Michtav Meliyahu, the 4th section, he says, Mishkan is makom hashechina, the place. The word Mishkan implies the place for God's divine presence, okay? And he says, Behu bichinat hitchabrut v'simcha. And he says that the function of Mishkan, where God rests his presence, is a place of a sense of tremendous closeness. Hitchabrut, he says, like to become connected, like almost dveikut, I think, connecting with the divine amidst joy, because you feel close. As it says, Pikudei Hashem Yesharim, that the statutes of Hashem are upright, misamach elev, they cause the heart to rejoice. When I feel that I'm close with Hashem, I feel this warm feeling, a sublime joy. Mikdash, a place of holiness, Bechinat Richuk V'Havdalah. It's a place of distancing myself out of reverence and separating myself. V'ikaro avodah korbanot utefila. And that's a place of offering korbanos. It's a place of davening. It's a place where v'hainu bechinat hitbatlut v'yirat haromimut. It's a place of nullifying any sense of self and completely being in awe of the divine presence that is in front of me. So that's what mikdash is. And what Rav Dessler concludes is that you can't have one without the other. There has to be a constant vacillation and moving back and forth between the mishkan and the mikdash. If a person is filled with too much joy out of the dancing that takes place on Simchas Torah, or out of the dancing that takes place on a Friday night for Licha Dodi, and he forgets about the reverential part of the tefillah, so then that the Mishkan no longer becomes the Mikdash. And if a person only focuses on the awesome aspect of the sanctuary without feeling the warmth and the closeness, then he loses the Mishkan. And this is the perpetual balancing act that every Jew has to make between Yira and Ahava. And that, for Rav Dessler, is the difference between Mishkan and Mikdash. We could certainly understand when Hashem first commands us to build a holy place, he says, first make sure that it's a Mikdash, that it is a place of extreme reverence for the divine. And only then will I allow you to call it a Mishkan, a place where you can commune with Hashem and feel that sense of closeness. Because just like a parent has to establish the parameters, or just like a teacher the first day of school has to establish the rules and make sure that the children understand these are the policies, and and then only afterwards you can soften, right? First it has to be called a mikdash, and then afterwards it can be called a mishkan. And notice that it's a mishkan multiple times throughout the Torah. And this brings us to finally just review a song that is ascribed to Rav Hutner, that was written, the beautiful poem Bilvavi Mishkan Evneh. But really, Rav Hutner was basing himself on a 16th century poem, which was written by Rabbi Elazar Azkari. Rabbi Elazar Azkari also wrote Yedid Nefesh, which is something that we sing on Friday nights, Shabbos afternoons. And he also wrote the Sefer HaCharedim, which is a very important work on Jewish thought. So he writes, Bilvavi Mishkan Evne Lahadar Kevodo, in my heart I will build a Mishkan to the Lahadar Kevodo, to the beautification of God's glory. Uva Mishkan Mizbeach Akim Lekarnei Hodo. And in this Mishkan, I will set up an altar to the horns of his Hod. How would you translate Hod? Splendor. Thank you for that. In other words, using flowery language, I have an obligation not only to build a Mishkan, but I also have an obligation to build an altar in my heart as well. Ulener Tamid, as far as the Ner Tamid that has to constantly be burning on that altar, Ekachli et Eish HaAkedah. I will take the fire of Akedas Yitzchak and constantly remind myself about how I have to be prepared to give my life al Kiddush Hashem. Ule Korban, and as far as the korban itself, Akrivlo et Nafshi HaYechida. I will offer to Hashem my singular soul. And this is the Mishkan that we're talking about. It's really a mikdash. And our exercise today was to just remind ourselves that the idea of building a mikdash / mishkan is not really an archaic exercise, but it's an ongoing exercise that each and every one of us should be striving for, to be able to make our lives like a temple, a place where I am proud for Hashem to come and visit because of the work that I've put into sanctifying my life. Like the Shem Yishmol said, that it is filled with temporary holy places and holy experiences, as well as the perennial holy experiences of my familiar places, just like the difference between courtship and marriage. And it is filled with this balance between a love of Hashem and a feeling of closeness, as well as this feeling of reverence. So basic ideas, but I hope that I was able to frame it in a slightly different way than normal. Okay, so Shloimi has tabernacle, Oxford Dictionary, a fixed or movable habitation, typically of light construction. Thank you. The oldest, and Shlomi says, the oldest active synagogue building in Europe is the Altneu in Prague. In the US, Newport, Rhode Island, the Touro Shul, 1763. In Canada, the Spanish Portuguese Synagogue in Montreal, 1768. Thank you very much. There you go. He saved you the homework assignment, Esther.
Actually, I can.
Go ahead, please.
The oldest one still in operation is in India. It was built in 1568.
Mhm. There you go. So that's more than 369 years old. Yeah, there you go. Okay, well, maybe it's worth a trip to India. Just take your tetanus and your antiviral drugs before you go. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful week. And Amir Tzashem will see you soon.